There are many well-known principles in chess. In this video, however, we examine the one and only most important principle according to the great romantic player Mikhail Chigorin, namely the skill of making combinations and the ability to find the most purposeful move in every given position. To illustrate this principle, we'll examine a game where Chigorin violates lots of classic principles and follows only his own principle. This leads to one of his most spectacular and rapid attacks executed at thunderbolt speed. The game ends in just 26 moves. So let's dive into this masterpiece. Chigorin's opponent, Teichmann, starts with d4, Chigorin plays d5, and after c4, right on move 2, Chigorin begins to violate the classic principles. He plays the defense which is named after him, the Chigorin defense, knight c6, which from the point of view of classic principles is a terrible move, because the knight blockades the c-pawn, and now the pawn can neither move to c6 to reinforce the central d5 pawn, nor to c5 to attack white's center. That means white will get a chance to build a strong pawn center while black won't be able to do it. However, the Chigorin defense has its point. The idea is to develop the pieces as soon as possible, getting the advantage in development, open up the center and put pressure on white's center with the pieces. And in order to fulfill this plan, or as Chigorin puts it, in order to fulfill the highest principle of chess, Chigorin will violate all other traditional principles. So in this position, white has three main moves: knight c3, or immediate c takes d, after which black captures with the queen and white doesn't have time to play knight c3 with a tempo, attacking the black queen right away, because the d4 pawn is under attack, so white must first defend the pawn either by playing e3 or knight f3. Or the third move, instead of c takes d or knight c3, is knight f3, which took place in our actual game. The idea is to defend the d4 pawn first and threaten to capture on d5 next move, after which black recaptures with the queen, and now that the pawn is defended, white will develop the knight with a tempo, attacking the black queen. That's why Chigorin develops another minor piece, attacking the knight which is defending the pawn. And after white captures on d5, of course black doesn't capture. That would be a mistake, because that would let white develop a piece with a tempo attacking the queen. But instead of queen takes d5, Chigorin violates another principle. He gives up his strong bishop exchanges his strong bishop for the knight. So he captures on f3. Chigorin preferred knights to bishops. Now the main line is g takes f, after which white gets the advantage of two bishops, but his pawn structure is damaged. So white has a slight advantage in this case. But in our game, instead of g takes f, it seems that Teichmann didn't want to double his pawns on the f file. He captures on c6, and Chigorin retains the bishop pair after bishop takes c6. Knight c3 followed. Now white is ready to push the d pawn forward with a tempo. That's why e6, preventing it. And now it would be better for white to occupy the center. But Chigorin prepared bishop b4 in this case, pinning the knight, which is defending the pawn, so black is threatening to capture on e4. The most sensible move for white would be f3, defending the pawn, and white of course is slightly better on account of his strong pawn center, but black also gets a very good counterplay after queen h4 check. Black is ready to castle queenside and put pressure on the d4 pawn. But instead of e4 in our game, white plays bishop f4. Chigorin develops another minor piece, taking the e4 square under control. Now white cannot play e4 anymore, so he plays e3 instead, and bishop b4. Again, Chigorin is ready to exchange his bishop for the knight. Queen b3 followed, attacking the bishop, and knight d5, defending the bishop, putting more pressure on the pinned knight, and also targeting the bishop on f4. Black is threatening to capture on c3 with the bishop, and after b takes c, black will capture on f4, white will be forced to capture with the pawn, and white's pawn structure would be ruined. That's why, to prevent this, white retreats the bishop to g3. and Chigorin castles. So if white now plays e4, that would be a mistake, because after knight takes c3, b takes c, and bishop a5, it would turn out that both central pawns are under attack. Black is threatening to capture on d4, as the c3 pawn isn't really defending the d4 pawn as it's pinned. And besides that, black is also threatening to capture on e4, and there is no way white can defend both of these pawns. So, of course, Teichmann didn't play e4. Instead, as black has developed all his minor pieces and castled already, while white hasn't developed the bishop and his king is still in the center, Teichmann plays bishop d3, and he was going to castle kingside next move. But Chigorin makes another creative move, preventing white from castling kingside. He plays queen g5. The bishop on d3 is unguarded. So if white castles, which would be a blunder, black would first capture on c3, and after b takes c, he would capture on e3. And if white captures the knight, then of course after queen takes e3 check, the bishop falls and black would be 2 pawns up. That's why, of course, Teichmann didn't castle kingside in this position. Instead, he plays queen c2, defending his bishop and creating the queen and bishop battery, targeting h7. And Chigorin makes another move, which, from the point of view of traditional principles, is a terrible concession. He plays f5, creating a backward pawn and permanently weakening the e5 square, and white will get a chance to create a seemingly great outpost on this square. However, again, Chigorin has his point. By playing f5, he not only closed the diagonal, but also took the e4 square under control, preventing the advance of the white e-pawn, and thus Chigorin secured the great position of his central knight. So now computer still shows as the best move for white, short castle. But from the human perspective, of course, it looks dangerous. Now that the black queen is on the king side and the black pawn is on f5, black might first, of course, take care of his h7 pawn, for example, by pushing it to h6, so that it doesn't fall under attack of the battery, and then prepare f4 and start a very strong and unpleasant attack on the white king. So instead of castling kingside, Teichmann decides to castle queenside. But first he plays bishop e5, creating a seemingly strong outpost, targeting the g7 pawn. Now, of course, if black captures on g2, then that might be quite dangerous, because the g file would open and white would castle queenside, followed by rook g1, putting pressure on black's kingside. So Chigorin wasn't interested in material. He was a romantic player, so of course he didn't capture on g2. Instead, he plays rook f7, defending the g7 pawn and another weakness on c7. And white castles queenside, unpinning his knight. Now that the king isn't on e1 anymore, the knight isn't pinned, and white is ready to eliminate black's central knight. And again, from the point of view of traditional principles, and computer also recommends this move, black should play knight takes c3. However, Chigorin, as was already mentioned, gave preference to knights, so for him the central knight is stronger than bishop. So he captures on c3 with the bishop, giving his opponent the advantage of 2 bishops and also letting his opponent reinforce the center. Now the d4 pawn is even stronger. So we have reached the critical position. It might seem that white is better. White has a strong pawn center. White has 2 bishops. White king looks completely safe on the queen side, because the black's strongest piece, the queen, cannot take part in the attack on white king, because the queen is placed on the king side. While white is ready to start a very strong attack on black king after rook g1, followed by g4 and g takes f, opening the g file, after which black's position might become critical. However, it isn't the case. Actually, the opposite is the case. The game will end just in 10 moves. Black will win. So you can pause the video now and try to find Chigorin's plan and how he executes this plan. So the plan is to initiate an attack on the white king, and Chigorin starts the attack with b5. One idea of this move is to take under control the c4 square and prevent the possible advance of the white c-pawn. As you see, both black pawns control the e4 and c4 squares, preventing the advance of white e and c pawns, thus securing the great position of the knight. And another idea behind b5 is to push the pawn forward to b4 when the right time comes, in order to open files on the queen side and start a very strong attack. White plays rook g1, preparing g4 of course, but Chigorin reroutes the queen from the king side to the queen side, queen e7, targeting a3 square. Now if white plays g4, in accordance with his plan, after queen a3 check, the pawn on c3 will also fall under attack. To defend the pawn, white must play king d2, but black would play b4, attacking the c3 pawn for the third time, and also opening the diagonal for the bishop, and bishop a4 would threaten, which would target both the queen and the rook. So what to do? Queen a3 check is coming. Computer recommends king b2. However, from human perspective, again, this might look too dangerous. The king isn't safe on the b file, and Chigorin was going to play rook b8 followed by b4 with a strong attack. Although computer shows more or less equality, the position would be very sharp, and the white king might, of course, it would be very difficult for white to find the precise defensive moves. So instead of king b2, which was objectively the strongest move, white plays rook f1. The idea is to move away the rook from this square so that it doesn't fall under attack of the bishop once black plays bishop a4, of course. But this lets Chigorin invade a3 with a check and also attack c3 pawn. That's why king b2, king d2, defending the pawn. And now b4 followed, attacking the c3 pawn and vacating the a4 square for the opening the diagonal for the bishop so that it invades a4. White finally pushes the c-pawn, kicking out the knight from its great central position. But now both the knight and the bishop will become even more active. First the bishop a4 with a tempo attacking the queen, and the queen must keep an eye on the pawn, otherwise black queen would capture it and invade the second rank. So the only square for the queen is b1, and now that the queen is on b1, the knight invades c3, and again with a tempo. And black forces the white queen to move to the corner of the board where it's terribly placed, of course. And Chigorin develops his last piece, rook d8, creating an unpleasant X-ray on the d file, targeting both the king and the bishop. White finally plays g4, but of course it's too late. White doesn't have any chances for a strong attack because his queen isn't taking part in the attack, and the weakness on the king side is defended by the f7 rook. And Chigorin plays knight e4 check. Now, if white captures the knight after f takes e, the f file would open, black can put more pressure on this file. Besides that, which is even more important, the pawn is very strong, it controls the d3 square, and black is threatening to invade d3, after which the c4 will also fall, and white's position would collapse. And if white prevents the invasion of the black queen on d3 by playing queen b1, then the queen would invade c3 with a check, and again the c4 pawn would fall. Black would be up a pawn first, then black can play bishop b5 check, winning the exchange. So black would be up the pawn and exchange, and his attack would continue. That's why after knight e4 check, white didn't capture on e4, instead he plays king e2. And now we can see the idea behind rook d8. Chigorin plays knight c5. The knight maneuvers are really impressive. So black is threatening to capture on d3. And white cannot capture the knight because now you will see the power. You can see the power of the rook. Black would simply capture on d3 with a devastating attack, with checkmate in a few moves. What else can white do? The bishop is under attack. If the only square of retreat for the bishop is b1, but in this case the bishop would close the communication between the queen and the rooks, and the queen would be unguarded, and black would play knight b3, and the queen would be lost. It doesn't have any squares to move, and if white captures, of course, the queen still would get lost. So after knight c5, the only way of defending the bishop is queen b1. But now black captures on d3, and after queen takes d3, the pawn isn't defended anymore. It falls, and the black queen invades the second rank with a check. After king f3, bishop c2, another strong move, attacking the queen, and it turns out that the queen is lost. If queen, what squares does the queen have? Only e2 and d2. If it moves to e2, then after bishop e4 check, of course, the queen is immediately lost. And if the queen moves to d2, then still bishop e4 check would follow. And after, the only way to save the queen is king e2, defending the queen. But in this case, Chigorin prepared bishop f3 check. Now again, if the king takes, then the queen falls. And if the king doesn't take and moves to e1, then the king gets checkmated in 2 moves. That's why after bishop c2, as white is losing the queen or gets checkmated, he resigned. And now I recommend watching one of Chigorin's most famous games where he sacrificed his queen on move 10. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.